Our topic today, how innovation works, is about as important a topic as we could possibly touch upon. Why? Because all change, all great change requires innovation in something or the other, right? And how one manages the whole innovation process is critical to our survival, and it's also critical to our progress. Now, it's very rare to have individuals who will have a very broad spectrum of understanding of what innovation is all about. Because innovation, by definition, is not confined to any one sphere, right? It could be innovation in social norms, it could be innovation in technology, it could be innovation in basic, all kinds of innovations. And it takes a very special person to be able to say something interesting about so vast a topic. And the person that we have with us is of that ilk. Interestingly enough, and I was looking at his bio, and the person, the chair of our session, she introduced him. But very interestingly, he wrote his thesis at Oxford on the mating system of the common pheasant, right? So he's obviously a very well-trained zoologist, geneticist, scientist, but one who, as he was telling me earlier today, got too bored with the narrowness of academic life, something that I can deeply sympathize with, and decided to, so to speak, spread his wings, if I may mix metaphors a little bit, and developed and basically had a very interesting life, some of which I think has been shared with us. He's written these wonderful books that deal with everything from DNA to culture to technology to innovation, and more importantly, because of his stints, various stints in journalism and at the House of Lords, he's had a ringside view of many of the major developments of our time. And he's used that perspective, not only to look at the major perspectives, to look at the major innovations of our time, but also to look at the greatest innovations of all time. And I texted him a couple of weeks ago that I was having a blast reading this wonderful book. I would strongly suggest that you go out, get a copy, and get him to sign it before you leave the festival, because it's going to be a treat. And the reason is that he takes the familiar and he makes it unfamiliar. And he takes the unfamiliar and makes it familiar. I'll give you an example. And I'll come to him. Believe me, this is about Matt talking and it's about you talking. I'm just the midwife. I'm just going to make the baby be born, but essentially you will do all of the heavy lifting. So, but nonetheless, I need to set the context for this, because only then will we get the full benefit of his presence here. Now, I said he takes the familiar and makes it unfamiliar, and he takes the unfamiliar and makes it familiar. Let me give you an example. We all know, right, that Edison invented the light bulb, or so I thought. And in his book, I learned that it was not Edison alone, but it was really about 22 separate individuals who contributed to making the light bulb. Now, why is this important? This is important because unless we understand the true nature of innovation, we cannot support it properly, we cannot foster it, we cannot teach it, and we cannot fully benefit from it. So in that sense, this book is very, very timely. So here is what I'm going to do. I'm now basically going to pick his brain and ask him to give you a couple of key insights from this book. And as I said, reading this book for me has been a voyage of discovery. I made, I think 6 or 7 pages of notes under 22 separate headings. Now, believe me, we're not going to be able to get to more than a few. But my goal is to talk about 1 or 2 of those, and perhaps a few more that you will prompt him for, and draw out a few lessons. And then towards the end, talk about what is coming. Because the world is about to be changed fundamentally, as we know. So I want to not just look at the past and what has happened so far, but also to look into the future with the lens of the past to see if we can make sense of the future, right? That's a plan? Good. All right. So actually, let's start with the bulb example, right? There are bulbs all around us here. Say a little bit about how that process, how the modern light bulb came to be. What was that process of, so many inventors basically contributing to it, and then ultimately we have it everywhere?
Yeah, Shailendra, it's fantastic to be here with you, and we've already had a great conversation. I'm looking forward to picking your brains at some point as well. The light bulb comes into existence in the 1870s. Edison gets most of the credit, but if you live in northeast England, as I do, we give all the credit to a guy called Swan. And if you live in Russia, you say it was Lodygin who invented it, and so on. And actually, these people did independently invent the same idea at the same time, which is weird. How does that happen? Well, it happens because the idea was ripe. It was ready to go. The preceding technologies of electricity and glass blowing and vacuum pumps and things had reached the point where it was inevitable someone would invent the light bulb. You couldn't stop it being invented, even if you tried. Just as it was inevitable the search engine would be invented around 1990. And I'll come back to that point, because the weird thing is, although it was inevitable, it wasn't predictable. And there's an interesting difference there.
Inevitable, but not predictable.
Yes, I'll deal with that now, actually, because I think nobody sees the light bulb coming. Nobody sees the search engine coming. If you read in the 1980s, people say we're going to network computers so they can all talk to each other. And nobody says, hang on, we're going to need things that enable us to search for information in this network. And if I invent a good one, I'll make a lot of money. Even Sergey Brin and Larry Page didn't think they were inventing a search engine, let alone a commercial one. They thought they were mapping the internet. Until it dawned on them that they had hit a gold mine, and that actually this was going to be, and still is, an enormously profitable device. So there's a strange asymmetry here that lots of people invented search engines. Google was only one of many. But nobody saw it coming. And I don't fully understand that. It's one of the mysteries of innovation, I think. You said it's a very important process. It's a very key process. It's one we need to understand if we're going to improve the world. But we genuinely don't, I think, understand it. A lot of policy that tries to encourage innovation is based on very poor understanding of it, and particularly the myth that you can pick winners, you can decide which innovations in advance are going to be successful. There's a wonderful quote from the head of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, in 2007, where he said, "There is no chance of the iPhone gaining significant market share. No chance." And it blew away Nokia and BlackBerry and all these others.
Yes.
And people didn't see that coming. So one of the things I want to get across is innovation is the main event of the last 200 years. It's the big reason we've increased prosperity incredibly. I'm the only person, well, I'm not the only person, but my generation is the only generation that has lived through the diminution of global extreme poverty from over 50% when I was born to about 8% today, measured on exactly the same level.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
Sure.
Nobody's ever had an experience like that, entirely because of innovation. And yet we still don't quite know how to turn it on, turn it off, how to encourage it, how to enable it to flourish. And just back to the light bulb, one of the important lessons, because Edison is a very important person,
right,
as an innovator, not an inventor. And the distinction I make there is he doesn't come up with the original light bulb, but he does make it more reliable, affordable, and available. And he does that through trial and error. And if you talk to innovators today, Jeff Bezos,
right,
even Elon Musk, trial and error is the thing they emphasize. You don't get it right first time. You do a ton of experiments. You fail again, and again, and then eventually you work out how to succeed. Edison tried 6,000 different types of plant material for the filament of his first light bulb.
6,000 different types of plant material.
Different plants, until he settled upon Japanese bamboo, of a particular kind that gave a particularly good filament. This is before they made metal filaments,
of course.
Obviously. And that's the kind of perseverance you need to be a great innovator. And one of the things I like about that phenomenon...
The Japanese bamboo was ultimately not used. That was not the final filament that Edison used, right? It was a metal filament, wasn't it?
I think that metal filament came about 10 years later, but now you've found a hole in my knowledge. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'll need to go back and check on that.
All right. But, and by the way, the same story is repeated with regard to the turbine, right?
Yes.
The initial, you mentioned that Parsons' turbine was about 2% efficient. And today, the turbines that we have that power so much of our industry and airlines, right, are 60% efficient.
It's very incremental. It's very gradual.
Yeah.
And we think of innovation as a sudden process that disrupts an industry. You know, you invent ChatGPT and the world changes or something. But actually, if you look behind the curtain, you find a series of incremental steps that improve a technology to the point where it can start disrupting. And even after that, you find a series of more incremental steps for improving it afterwards. So I'm trying to, in this book, I'm trying to get away from the idea of innovation as a brilliant white light that goes on above the head of one very clever person. It's never like that.
Right.
It's quite ordinary people collaborating. You've got to have a team, you've got to have people bouncing ideas off each other, experimenting, failing, trying again, persevering, and networking their ideas having sex, as I like to put it, and producing baby ideas.
Having sex.
So it's and one of the things I like about this view of innovation is that it gets away from this, I don't like the word creativity.
You don't like the word creativity. Why?
Because it slightly implies there are special people who do this.
See.
And non-special people need not apply. And I don't think that's true. I think really quite ordinary people can be innovators if they persevere, if they experiment, if they try again. And I think for the young, we need to be saying, you know, this is a network, collaborative effect. It's not a individual genius effect.
You mentioned something very interesting, and that is something that we as a nation or nations need to be thinking about, which is regulation. Now, a stunning point that you make in your book is with regard to nuclear power, which again is in the news for all the right reasons. That in a book published in 1990, and I'm quoting from your book, The Nuclear Energy Option, the nuclear physicist Bernard Cohen argued that the reason we stopped building nuclear plants in the 1980s in the West was not from fear of accidents, which is the narrative that we have in our minds right now, but because of the inexorable escalation of costs driven by regulation.
Yes, and in the UK, we are building a couple of nuclear reactors. They're enormously expensive. And the amount of concrete that goes into them, the amount of steel is gone up hugely. But the amount of paper that goes into them has gone up even more. In other words, an inordinate amount of form filling and testing of ideas. And one way in particular in which this is happening is that if you agree with the regulator on a design of a nuclear reactor, then you must not deviate it by one screw or one nut without going back to the regulator and starting again. Now, this destroys innovation, because innovation has to learn by doing. It has to say, oh, actually, there's a better way of doing this. And you can't go back to square one and spend another 3 months and another £1 million changing your design every time this happens. And the countries like South Korea that are driving down the cost of nuclear are learning from this, and the Canadians, funnily enough, are
and the Chinese. I think they're building most of the reactors.
So, airplanes are similar. They stopped improving really in the 1980s. I mean, well, 1969 was the 747. We flew that for 50 years. We think we live in an age of dramatic innovation. We don't. We live in an age of dramatic digital innovation, but no innovation in transport at all in my lifetime, really. Where is the routine space travel, the personal jetpack, all that stuff that
Hopefully
I was promised.
flying cars should come soon.
Well,
I think those...
We've been saying flying cars will come soon since the 1950s. So I do worry that bureaucracy can kill innovation, and we need to find a way to lighten the bureaucratic load on innovators.
So since we are speaking about flying objects, let me turn to airlines. And there's a very interesting point that he makes in his book. If I were to paraphrase it, you need to be a little bit of an outlaw to be an innovator, right? And this is the story of Herb Kelleher, the person who created the model for Southwest Airlines. By the way, Southwest is not a name that is known here in India, but if you think of Indigo or SpiceJet, they essentially just copied the book line by line, paragraph by paragraph, comma by comma, full stop by full stop. Literally just borrowed that model to compete against Jet Airways, which was there at that time. And Jet Airways' history, Indigo is the big 800-pound gorilla. Now, what is interesting about Herb Kelleher is that when he founded Southwest Airlines in 1967 as a low-cost airline, he was literally run out of the industry and even the state by the existing airlines. And in fact, the existing airlines almost, did they actually get him in jail or threatened to get him in jail?
They sued him and they got him blocked. I don't think he actually went to jail.
Okay.
Maybe he did, I can't remember. But certainly, you're right. The innovators are often disruptors, and there is huge resistance, an immense immune reaction in incumbent industries.
Immune reaction, very interesting. As a biologist, you say that. It's a very good metaphor, right? Xeno rejection. It's like a foreign organ that is being put in your body, and you need to give immunosuppressants.
Yeah, yes, and that happens a lot. But also the other point about Herb Kelleher is that what he was doing was driving down the price.
Yes.
And great innovators do that. Often it's more important to drive down the price of something than to invent it in the first place. It's harder, it's more difficult to do. And if you think of what Jeff Bezos does, he doesn't invent e-commerce,
right,
but he makes it work and he drives down the price of it.
The better, cheaper, faster.
Better, cheaper, faster. And we can come back to DeepSeek, but of course that
we'll come to that. Just hold that thought.
Okay,
we'll come to that. Yeah. I want to talk about two things that are of great interest to us here in India, out of the many that I could possibly talk about, and this is the Green Revolution. I'm old enough to remember the time when India could not feed itself. Today, and by the way, we've not used this term in India, but today India is the granary of the world. 40% of the global rice exports come from India. And if for whatever reasons, political sometimes, because an election is around the corner, if we block exports from India to other countries, it basically leads to hunger in those countries. It's that stark. So from being a from a famine-prone nation in 1967 to being a food surplus nation where free food is made available to 800 million people today, if they want it, it's quite a journey. And behind that is a very interesting story of innovation. And again, the great thing about this book is that I had only heard about Norman Borlaug. But he talks about a whole chain of innovations that actually begins in Japan, from what I understand. Would you tell that story to us? Because this is directly relevant to us. Because this is the reason why we are where we have a problem now, not with malnourishment today, but with obesity. So it's a good problem to have, certainly compared to the other one. But please tell us that story.
Yes, it's hard to overestimate the degree of pessimism there was about India, the Indian subcontinent generally, in the 1960s in terms of population, in terms of food. There were all these books called Famine 1975, which were saying, don't give India food aid. Yes. It'll only encourage more breeding and they're going to die anyway.
The idea of triage, right? That there are some people who cannot be saved in the battlefield, so let them die. That is what these two brothers, Paddock and Paddock, right?
Yeah, Paddock and Paddock.
They argued that let the Indians die.
And this was very influential even in Washington. So
Yeah.
one of the reasons President Johnson insists on food aid to India being conditional on sterilization programs is a really...
Really?
Yeah, there's a pretty spooky story there too. You know, that's where a lot of that very authoritarian sterilization program that
Interesting.
But
tell us the story. Tell us the story about
the
wheat
genes,
plant
yeah.
that used to sort of topple over.
So how do we increase the yields of wheat and rice and other plants? We want to get synthetic fertilizer to make them grow thicker. But if you just add fertilizer to an old wheat variety, it grows tall and then it falls over and then you can't harvest it.
Because the wheat kernel becomes too big. It's like a person who's become so overweight that he topples over.
Well, it becomes too dense, the crop, and so it falls over. So you need dwarf varieties. And if you shrink the size of wheat from sort of this height to this height, then more of the energy of the wheat goes into the grain, but it doesn't fall over. And at the end of the Second World War, a man named Cecil Salmon was in Japan as part of General Douglas MacArthur's occupation force. He was a scientist, and he found a Japanese research station that was growing dwarf wheat varieties. And they'd found these in Korea. So the story starts in Korea. It came to Japan. The Japanese had developed these varieties called Norin 10. And so he took the seeds back to America. He gave them to a guy called Orville Vogel in Oregon. He crossbred them with a high-yielding wheat variety called Brevin, and the result was the Norin Brevor hybrid wheat, which turned out to be able to be immensely more high-yielding with fertilizer applied to it. That was then picked up on by a guy called Norman Borlaug, who was trying to improve wheat yields in Mexico.
Yeah.
And he transformed Mexican agriculture with these new varieties, persuading farmers to adopt them. Borlaug then traveled to India and Pakistan, and he was very persistent, hammering on doors and saying, you know, you've got to try these new varieties. They could transform your wheat yields in the Punjab in particular, which is a big wheat growing area. And Swaminathan...
Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, yes.
Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, an Indian biologist, championed the cause of this wheat. And they even somebody was persuaded to plough up his cricket pitch and plant it with these varieties to demonstrate but there was great resistance. You know, these are outside varieties, we shouldn't be accepting them, etc., etc.
So I'm going to quote something here that I think will refresh your memory. Fascinating, because I lived through this episode, right? I mean, I'm old enough to have actually heard about these people. Remember, in the 60s, when Shastri became Prime Minister, agriculture was kind of like a punishment portfolio. That was not sexy, right? You gave it to the least competent people. But Shastri, with his motto of Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, Jai Hind, was very clear that this was the key to India's future. So he persuaded C. Subramaniam to become the agriculture minister. Very smart individual. Tamils often are. And a very smart individual. And he basically was very open to that. But there were still some forces. And when Norman Borlaug met with the head of the Planning Commission, Ashok Mehta gave him 10 reasons why they should not import these varieties of wheat, because they would have to then bring in fertilizer companies, and then foreign firms would come in, and that would be imperialistic, and that would be this, and that would be that. And Norman Borlaug said, and I quote from your book, tear up those 5-year plans, start again and multiply everything for farm support 3 or 4 times, increase your fertilizer, increase your support prices, increase your loan funds, then you will be closer to what is needed to keep India from starving. Imagine your country free from famine. It is within your grasp. These were the words that basically changed history for us. So, folks, innovation is not just something that is nice to have. It is something that we must have. Now,
I hope you're going to come back to a story where the West learns from India rather than the other way around. Maybe the zero story?
We could, but the zero story will take at least 10 minutes, and I think William has told that very well. in his book.
Oh.
So the zero story, while it is there in his book, and do read it here, but since William has already touched upon it, I will go on to something else, because I do want to come to the audience, and we have just about 20 minutes, under 20 minutes left here. So I would like to spend the bulk of the time with the audience, but I do want to take 3 or 4 minutes for you to prognosticate. Now look into the future, please. So there is this young kid from this little village in China who just made headlines last week and knocked off $1 trillion from the US stock market. His name is Liang Wenfeng, the person who founded DeepSeek, right? So your thoughts on what DeepSeek is, how it came about, and what does it mean for the future? And then after that, we'll go to you, and I'll be happy to facilitate that conversation after that. But go ahead.
Well, I think we have to be a little bit skeptical still before we accept everything we're told about DeepSeek, because I don't know enough, and other people don't know enough yet, exactly how it was developed and so on. But it's open source. We can lift the bonnet and look inside the engine of DeepSeek in a way that we can't with ChatGPT, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So, and therefore we can adapt it and play with it and change it. This is an AI that is apparently much, much cheaper, both in terms of the money it costs and the energy it uses, than the large language models we've had up until now, ChatGPT and others like them. Now, as I said before, the great role innovators can do is bring down the cost of something. You know, famously, the cost of artificial light has come down by ridiculous amounts over history. So if we can make AI cheap, then it really will change the world in dramatic ways. I'm reluctant to make specific forecasts about the future because nobody is any good at forecasting the future of technology. I talked about the failure to see the search engine coming and things like that. But actually, there are no experts on the future, in my view, in these complex dynamic systems like an economy. And so nothing I say about what the world is going to look like in 2050 should be relied upon. And to some extent, I'm betting in a slightly different direction, which is that my grandparents lived through incredible changes in transport. I lived through incredible changes in communication and computing. My children and grandchildren may live through incredible changes in something else.
Right.
It might be biomedicine that is dominant. AI might be the last flourishing of the sort of digital thing. And also, we've seen so many false dawns with AI that I wouldn't want to promise that it can change the world as much as some people think. Nonetheless, you know, sat-nav is AI. We don't call it that, but it is. It's,
sorry, what is that?
Satellite navigation.
Satellite navigation,
GPS
yes.
And all that. So, you know, we are already changing the world with AI. And I think what these generative AI systems are going to do, and we talked about this a little bit, is they're going to threaten the employment prospects of the educated elite for the first time.
Yes.
Previous automations have threatened the employment prospects of people without such elite educations. So that's why we're seeing the panic now, because it's the elite who are under threat. But you know, I personally am very optimistic about what we can do with these AIs. I'm not particularly pessimistic about malevolent artificial general intelligence. A, I think it's still a long way off, AGI is, and B, I think there's no particular reason why it should become malevolent. But I do think that we are going to have some significant downsides as well as wonderful upsides from this technology, and it probably will be very disruptive. But I would probably have said the same about crypto 10 years ago and genomics 10 years before that, and I wouldn't have been right in the short term about them. So don't believe a word I say.
So in 2 minutes, I'll have questions from the audience. So I hope our microphones are ready, right? Just a minute. Just hold on. Microphones are ready. But I did want to I did want to mention the following. That again, there is a huge amount of excitement in India about AI. Several of the people who are doing interesting things in AI are roaming around this festival. Some of them have come on panels. And I've spoken to a couple of them, and they've all said the fact that two things have happened in AI suddenly means that India is in play. One, the cost has come down by a factor of 50, with this DeepSeek model. And B, DeepSeek put out the entire 83-page recipe about how they went about doing it, in open source. So which means that literally one of you with a powerful Mac M4 chip can literally install it and play around with it. And you have the full training data that you could use, and the inference engine, and actually build your own private LLMs. So this has suddenly democratized AI in a way, and let's not forget this. OpenAI and Perplexity and Anthropic are closed systems. They do not share their training weights. Beyond a certain point, they do not even share their methodologies. They only share the output. And therefore, this innovation has really democratized it. So with that, let's go to the audience.
Can I make one very quick postscript to that
the floor
point?
is yours.
I'm extremely optimistic about the role India is going to play in this coming world.
Say a bit more.
Europe is regulating itself to death on AI in particular, but innovation generally. China is far too autocratic, increasingly so, increasingly constraining what you can do. And if you ask DeepSeek about Tiananmen Square, you are not allowed to get an answer,
Sure.
for example.
But they found a creative way around that, right?
Yes, the numbers instead of the vowels,
Yes.
exactly. And even America has now become much more sclerotic about innovation. So the job of chief innovator in the world is currently vacant. You guys should apply.
Love that. So now questions. Let's have a show of hands. The young lady right here. See, this is the thing that I love most about JLF, which is the presence of such young, curious minds. So first of all, a big applause for our young lady here. Beta, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Amaya. My question is, what do you think will make India center of innovation in my lifetime?
Amazing, amazing.
Brilliant question, and I love the confidence that it will be. It's just what is the reason? In a word, freedom. The liberty of people to exchange ideas, collaborate, work together, and experiment is crucial to innovation. And India has that in a way that China doesn't, in a way that Europe doesn't because of regulation, in a way that America does to some extent, but less than others. So the combination of a fantastically well-educated country with a lot of free exchange of ideas and a great tradition of enterprise and conversation, which I think is a good description of India, means that you are very well placed to grasp the future of the world.
Do you argue with your parents a lot? Good, good. That is what we need. We need people who argue with their parents, right? So I think that's extremely important. All right. We'll go to the gentleman here, then we'll go straight to the back. But, sir? No, there's a microphone right here. I see you.
Matt, where does Chinese innovation stand in this sort of dynamic between the lack of freedom and innovation?
Yes, China sounds at first like a paradox. It's not a free country, but it has been very innovative. And it's not true to say it just copied and caught up with the West. That was true to start with, but actually it has pushed the envelope in all sorts of technologies. There's no question about that. It's been a very big engine of innovation in the last 20, 30 years. But my argument is that's because it actually was free for a while. Under Deng Xiaoping's compromise, as long as you don't invent a new political party, you can invent anything in China. And
Not a new religion.
Or a new religion. As long as you don't do that, you run into very few of the bureaucratic obstacles from low-level officials that are a big problem in other parts of the world. But I think that has come to an end. I think that Xi Jinping is so much more authoritarian that actually the economic dirigisme is now going to stifle the innovation that came out of China. And that's why I say the job is vacant.
By the way, you made a quip about politics and religion. I think Xi Jinping is just behaving like a good party host, right? Where the host or the hostess says, please, no talk about politics or religion. That makes for a good party. That is literally true in China. So let's go right at the back. Sir, the gentleman with the glasses, if you go right there. And then I'll come to the middle also.
You said that the elites will lose their jobs with the generative AI. But I'm an economist, so I do the research on it. But it seems like job polarization is happening. It's not the elite, but like people who are thinking that education is the way out of, their low standard of living. That may not be the case anymore. It is like a middle skill people with somewhat education, like some higher education, who will lose a lot with this generative AI, as compared to elites, because elites will find a way.
So you're saying the people who are well educated but not elite.
No, even well educated, like who can get well educated,
Okay.
like top institutes or whatever. But I'm saying that just who are like somewhat educated, like just a bachelor's degree or not that great.
Yeah, so is it going to be the case that people who have some kinds of degrees will be safe and other kinds of degrees will not be safe?
To some extent, that's bound to be true, but I think one of the interesting questions is, will AI threaten the professions, the lawyers and the accountants, much more than the intellectuals, as it were? I can see a significant disintermediation of the process of lawyers. Now, we all love lawyers, don't we? So this is very sad.
By the way, there's one prediction that I can make with 100% confidence. The one class that it will not affect, and they will have 100% employment, is the politicians. That I don't see that changing, and that's probably a good thing. We do
and
need
the
good
bureaucrats.
representation. Yes, sir. In the middle there, behind you, the gentleman in the glasses, and yeah. I'll come to you after that, since you were quite eager.
Matt, starting with the Red Queen and ending up with how innovation works, how has your thinking about science, genetics, and the interplay of innovation changed in your own lifetime and in your own thinking?
So you're asking just the right question, because his new book, he just showed me the cover of it, and I flipped through it. Tell us about your new book.
Yes,
it has the same eye-catching title.
He started with sex.
Yes, it's there as well.
And I've gone back to sex. My new book is coming out next month, and it's called Birds, Sex, and Beauty.
Birds, Sex, and Beauty.
And it's very specifically about why peacocks have tails. But it also, in the end, says, why do human beings have senses of humor? Because I think it's the same question. The role of mate selection in producing extravagant features in evolutionary processes is an idea that Darwin advanced, that nobody believed, and that actually I think it's really an important insight. Survival of the fittest gives you boring things like being able to survive. Mate selection as an evolutionary force gives you beauty and extravagance and creativity. Oh, I'm not supposed to like creativity, am I? But yes. So it's very much revisiting some of the ideas in the Red Queen, but taking them further. But to answer your question more generally, the parallels between biological evolution and technological innovation are more and more close. In fact, they're not parallels. It's simply an extension of the same process. And there's a wonderful new book, which I've just read, which is coming out shortly, which called Everything Evolves. My book was called The Evolution of Everything. But this guy, Mark Velland, has done an even better job of talking about how actually, there are things in the world that are run by laws, like physics and government. But there are other things that are run by the process of history, by path-dependent change. And we need to start seeing the evolution of culture and the evolution of technology in exactly the same way as we talk about the evolution of biology. And he talks about the Darwin distraction, that by thinking that evolution applies only to biology because of Darwin, we've kind of not noticed that there's this whole other world out there. So that's one of my big themes.
By the way, you said something about humor. You said humor is also fitness enhancing. Is it true?
No, humor is about seducing the opposite sex.
So it is fitness enhancing, right?
In the long, only for your grandchildren, not for you. It doesn't make you survive.
So there's a gentleman here with the cap.
Great talk, Matt. Thank you so much. Your point about innovation being inevitable suggests that the groundwork has to be laid out, ever present, so that someone can swoop in and innovate. But that also suggests that you need to constantly pour a lot of resources to be ever ready for this sort of a thing, which is why I think a lot of countries with great minds can't innovate at the pace that others can. How do we fix this problem? Because unless we're ready to jump in and innovate and lay that groundwork in terms of academic research, how do we really fix
Got
that
it.
problem?
Thank you. Your response.
Yeah, very good question. And this really gets to the question of what is an industrial policy. A bad industrial policy is one that says, these are the technologies we want to champion, and they're going to be the future. And you nearly always end up picking losers if you do that. A good industrial policy says, let's just make sure there's lots of opportunities, very good infrastructure, very good networks, very good communication, and then let 1,000 flowers bloom.
We'll have the young lady here have the last word. So we started with one young lady, we'll end with another. So you have the last word.
Hi, sir.
Why don't you stand up? Go ahead.
So we've got a question from Sneha here. It is, in a world where copying is more prominent than true innovation, how can we encourage innovation in all spheres?
Yes, good question. There's an awful lot of theft of ideas, an awful lot of imitation, etc. But imitation with improvement is no bad thing. One of the things I argue in my book here is that we've got far too obsessed with intellectual property, that actually patents and copyrights have become far too strong, and they've made it difficult. They're actually inhibiting innovation rather than encouraging it now. Now, I have to be careful when I say that in front of my publisher, because she could say, okay, so you don't want any copyright on your books, do you? You know, the copyright, that book is going to be copyrighted until 70 years after my death under British law. What? Why? Why should my great-grandchildren make money off my books? What have they done to deserve that? I'll tell you why that law came in. Because the Disney Corporation lobbied governments all around the world to say, we're about to start no longer making money out of Mickey Mouse. We'd like you to change the law. That's ridiculous.
So with that, ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for Matt Ridley.